What's up, y'all? So I am reading chapter 10 of this book. Honestly, James, she couldn't have been more livid, Margaret says. She kept it well under control, of course, but her mouth went tight and her eyes absolutely flashed fire. You know the way they do. I can't say I blame her having it thrown at her across the tea table like that in front of me in the netties. What was actually said? Dixon asked, executing a turn at the corner of the dance floor and beginning to lead her up towards the band. Well, he just said, "Oh, by the way, Carol, I've been meaning to tell you that Christine's coming to the dance after all, and she's bringing her uncle with her." Then he went off, facetious, facetious on her. He went off facetious on her, facetious on her, so as not to have uncle partnering niece, which wouldn't be according to the best usages. No, so as not to have uncle partnering niece, which wouldn't be according to the best usages or some rubbish like that. I thought the best thing would be to switch her on to my ticket if you've no objection. As if she could object with all the rest of us there listening. And Gory Euroheart would be only too pleased to escort you, I'm sure, and that was that. Dixon said, the strain of dancing always considerable and of keeping his eyes on Margaret's face as it bobbed and advanced and receded, made elaborate speech difficult for him. In addition, he had to keep straining his ears to catch the beat of the music above the swishing of many pairs of feet and the clamor of many conversations. A bit thick, that. I've never seen anything so abominably rude in my life. The man's quite impossible, James, socially and in every other way, I say. Though it struck me at the time, do you think there's anything, going on between Bertrand and Carol? I've no idea. What makes you say that? Haven't you ever noticed anything? I don't think so. Why? Oh, I don't know. It's really rather odd that he should ever be taking her to the ball and then her looking so furious. But Bertrand's always been pretty thick with both of them. I remember you were there when she told us, and it's only natural she would feel she was being pushed around a bit. Sorry, he added to a girl whose bottom had come into collision with his hip. He wished this set of dances would end. He was hot. His socks seemed to have been sprayed with fine adhesive sand, and his arms ached like those of a boxer, keeping his guard up after 14 rounds. He wondered why he didn't tell Margaret about the embrace he'd seen during the arty weekend. She always kept her mouth shut when told so. Perhaps it was that news, as well as shocking her, would make her mildly exultant, and he didn't want that. Why didn't he want that? Margaret was talking again, animatedly. Her face was a little flushed, and her lipstick had been more carefully applied than usual. She looked as if she was enjoying herself. Her sort of minimal prettiness was in evidence. Well, anyway, I think she's done a good deal better for herself with Mr. Urquhart. I must say he seems most charming, something quite exceptional these days. He's got the most beautiful manners, hasn't he? Quite the real thing. Bit of a change after the bearded monster. Dixon gargled inaudibly in his throat at this mixture of styles, but before he had time to reply, the dance wheeled to an end. In a moment, an uneasy thundering followed by a clashing thump signaled the end of the set. Dixon heaved a sigh and wiped his palms on his handkerchief. What about a drink, he said. Margaret was darting her eyes this way and that. Wait a minute, I just want to see if I can see the others. The dancers were trickling away onto the touch lines of the long dance floor. The walls were decorated with scenes from the remoter past, portrayed in what was no doubt an advanced style, so that in the one nearest Dixon, for example, some lack of perspective or similar commodity made a phalanx of dwarf infantrymen, Spartan, Macedonian, Roman, seemed to be falling from the skies upon their much larger barbarian adversaries, Persian, Iranian, Carthaginian, who, unaware of this danger overhead, gazed threateningly into the empty middle distance. At intervals stood large pillars of some pallid material. Dixon gave a sad, nostalgic smile. It all reminded him so clearly of those large eating establishments at Marble Arch, Charing Cross, Coventry Street, where he'd enjoyed himself so much. Lowering his eyes from these memorials, he caught sight of Michi in the crowd, talking and laughing vigorously with Miss O'Shaughnessy, the prettiest of the three pretty girls, and in fact, Michi girl. She had the kind of watered, gispy face, dusky but rosy, that affected him uncomfortably. The same was true of the low-cut dress she wore. Though he was 15 yards away from him, Dixon knew all about the perfection of Michi evening clothes, the efficiency of his chatter, and the attentiveness of his audience. Michi now caught his eye at once, became grave, and made him a shallow but courteous bow. Miss O'Shaughnessy managed a quick smile before turning away, beyond all question so as to laugh. What about a drink? Dixon asked Margaret again. Here they are, she said by way of reply. Bertrand and Christine were approaching. Bertrand, Dixon had to admit, was quite presentable in evening clothes, and to say of him now that he looked like an artist of some sort would have been true without being too offensive. It was on him that Dixon fixed his eye, less from interest than to avoid fixing it on Christine. Her manner to him so far that evening had been not even cold. It had been simply non-existent, and had made him feel that, contrary to the evidence of his senses, he wasn't really there at all. But worse than this, she was looking her best this evening. She wore a yellow dress that left her shoulder bare. It was perfectly plain managing, as it had been intended just for that, to reveal as decidedly ill-judged Margaret's royal blue taffeta with its bow and what he supposed were gatherings or something, and with the quadruple row of pearls above it. Christine's aim, he imagined, had been to show off the emphasis of her natural coloring and skin texture. The result was painfully successful, making everybody else look like an assemblage of granulated halftones. For a moment, as she and Bertrand came up, Dixon caught her eye, and although it held nothing for him, he wanted to cast himself down behind the protective wall. The skirts and trousers, or better, pull the collar of his dinner jacket over his head and run out into the street. He read somewhere, had been told that somebody like Aristotle or I.A. Richards had said that the sight of beauty makes us want to move towards it. Aristotle or I.A. Richards had been wrong about that, hadn't he? Well, what goes forward, people? Bertrand asked. He was holding Christine's wrist between finger and thumb, perhaps taking her pulse. He glanced at Dixon, to whom he'd so far been fairly amiable. Well, I thought we might go and have a drink, Dixon said. Oh, do be quiet, James. Anybody think you'd die if you went an hour with that one? He probably would, Bertrand said. Anyway, it's sensible of him to not want to take the risk. What about it, darling? I'm afraid there's only beer and cider unless you want to fare forward to an adjacent hostel, Ram. Yes, all right, but where's Uncle Julius and Mrs. Goldsmith? We can't go off and leave them. While it was being agreed that those two were probably already in the bar, Dixon grinned to himself at Uncle Julius. How marvelous it was that there should be somebody called that, and that somebody else to call him that, and that he himself should be present to hear one calling the other that. As he drifted off at Margaret's side, between the talking groups on one side and the mutes lining the walls on the other, he caught sight of Alfred Beasley standing rather miserably among the last named. Beasley, notorious for his inability to get to know women, always came to functions of this sort, but since every woman here tonight had come with a partner, except for women like the sexagenarian professor of philosophy or the 15-stone senior lecturer in economics, he must know he was wasting his time. Dixon exchanged greetings with them, and fancied he caught a gleam of envy in Beasley's eyes. Dixon reflected firstly how inefficient a bar to wasting one's time was the knowledge that one was wasting, especially in what Welch called matters of the heart. Secondly, how narrow a gap there really was between Beasley's status and his own in such matters. And thirdly, how little there was to envy in what established him as on the far side of the gap from Beasley. The privileges of being able to speak to one woman and of being in the same party as another. But fourthly, the possession of the signs of sexual privilege is the important thing, not the quality nor the enjoyment of them. Dixon felt he ought to feel calmed and liberated at reaching this conclusion, but he didn't, any more than unease in the stomach is alleviated by discovery of its technical name. They reached the bar, a small room not designed for the purpose, the still recent tradition of a wet summer. Ball had been instituted. Okay. Sorry guys, you just have to hear me read, okay? I just want to keep going with this book so I can start another one. But I did rip this part of the book on accident. It was hurting me to have my head forward because I had to lean forward towards the light on my car. So now I'm like, I can't read like this how I usually read with my head straight because I can't see it. So now I have to sit up like this, and it's kind of hurting my neck and my spine. But the still recent tradition of a wet summer ball had been instituted, though few could of course bring themselves to believe it by the college authorities, on the argument that the amount of drunkenness among student patrons, alarming at one time, could be reduced by providing cheap, non-spirituous liquors on the premises, and by thus rendering less acutely attractive the costly and injurious gulping of horses' necks, or of inferior gin and synthetic lime juice in the city's pubs. More oddly still, perhaps, this argument had shown itself to be sound, so that in the room now visited by Dixon and the rest, 3 minor college employees were toiling at barrels of beer and cider under panels representing, similarly to the larger ones in the ballroom, swarthy potentates about to be danced upon by tropes of midget Circassians, or caravans of Chinese merchants being sucked up into the air by whirlwinds. The pallid pillars were here replaced by potted and tumbled palms of an almost macabre luxuriance. Among these last lurked Makanachi, the titular supervisor of the three barmen, adding to the effect in some indefinable way by wearing a starch white coat over his olive green trousers. Gore, Urquhart, and Carol were sitting in one of the further palm groves, talking fairly hard. When he saw the others coming towards him, Gore Urquhart rose to his feet. This formality was so unfamiliar in the circles Dixon normally moved in that for a moment he wondered whether the other meant to oppose their approach by physical force. He was younger than Dixon had expected any distinguished man. He was younger than Dixon had expected any distinguished man and an uncle of Christine's to be, somewhere in the middle 40s. His evening suit, too, was not nearly as spectacularly flawless as might have been predicted. His large, smooth face, surmounting a short, thin body, was the least symmetrical, short of actual deformity that Dixon had ever seen, giving him the look of a drunken sage trying to collect his wits, a look intensified by slightly protruding lips and a single black eyebrow running from temple to temple. Before the party was finally seated, Makanachi, no doubt well-tipped already, loped forward to see what drinks were wanted. Dixon watched his servility with enjoyment. "I managed to keep out of your principal's way so far," Gore Urquhart said with a strong lowland Scottish accent. "That's no mean achievement, Mr. Go Urquhart," Margaret said with a laugh. "I'm sure he got all his spies out for you." "Do you think so now? Will I be able to get away again if he catches me?" "Most likely, sir," Burchard said. Are they being funny right there? "Most likely," Burchard said. You know what they like in this part. You know what they're like in this part of the world. Throw them a celebrity and they'll fight over him like dogs over a bone. But even in my small way, I've had a good deal of that sort of thing to endure, especially from academic so-called society. Just because my father happens to be a professor, they think I want to talk to the vice chancellor's wife about the difficulties her wretched grandson's having at this school, but of course it must be 1,000 times worse for you, sir. I am right. Who's Gore? You record, whatever. Having a little anxiety right now. I'll be fine. I gotta eat something. I feel like an anxiety because I'm alone. My hands are feeling cold. I'll be fine. I try to get through it right now. And I did get a little too high. I like the little, just anxiety, the little fight or flight type of bullshit, you know? I'm thinking negative in my head. But, I need some water. I haven't ate, so I'm thinking maybe I just get some energy. Thinking kind of like, just feeling nervous right now. But, so do you think so I would be able to get away again if he catches me? Right, okay, so Gore Urquhart, who'd been listening to this with attention, said briskly, "In some ways," and drank from his glass. "Anyway, Mr. Urquhart," Margaret said, "you're quite safe for the moment. The principal holds court on these occasions in a room at the other end of the dance floor. He doesn't mix with the rabble in there." "So while I'm with the rabble, I'm fairly safe, you mean, Miss Peel?" "Good, I'll stay with the rabble." Dixon had been expecting a silver-bows laugh from Margaret to follow this remark, but it was still hard to bear when it came. At the moment, Mananaki arrived with the drinks Gore Urquhart had ordered. To Dixon's surprise and delight, the beer was in pint glasses. After waiting for Urquhart's "Find me some cigarettes, laddie," to Manaki, he leaned forward and said, "How on earth did you manage to get pints? I have seen anything but halves in here the whole evening. I thought it must be a rule of the place. They wouldn't give me pints when I asked for them. How on earth did you round it?" While he said this, he saw irritably that Margaret was looking from him to Urquhart and back again and smiling deprecatingly, as if to assure Urquhart that, despite all evidence to the contrary, this speech betokened no real mental derangement. Bertrand, too, was watching and grinning. Gore Urquhart, who didn't seem to have noticed Margaret's smiles, jerked a short nicotine thumb towards the departing Makanaki, a fellow Scottish nationalist, he said. All the people facing Dixon and to his left, Gore Urquhart himself, Bertrand, and Margaret laughed at this, and so did Dixon, who looked for his right and saw Christine seated next to him, with their elbows on the table, smiling in a controlled fashion, and beyond her, Carol, at Gore Urquhart's left, staring rather grimly at Bertrand. Is Carol? Before the laughter cleared, Dixon noticed Bertrand becoming aware of the scrutiny and looking away. Perturbed by the small tension in the company and finding out that Gore Urquhart's eyes were fixed on him from under the black eyebrow, Dixon watched his glasses on to the right. Dixon twitched his glasses onto the right part of his nose and said at a venture, "Well, it's an unexpected pleasure to be drinking pints at a do like this." "You're in luck, Dixon," Goyukura said sharply, handing round cigarettes. Dixon felt himself blushing slightly and resolved to say no more for a time. Nonetheless, he was pleased that Goyukura caught his name. With a brain flourish of trumpets, the music started up in the ballroom and people began to move out of the bar. Bertrand, who settled himself next to Goyukura, began talking to him in a low voice, and almost at once, Christine addressed some remark to Carol. Who's Christine? I can't remember. Margaret said to Dixon, "It is sweet of you to have brought me here, James. Glad you're enjoying yourself. You don't sound as if you are very much." "Oh, I am really. I'm sure you're enjoying this part of it anyway, better than the actual dancing part." "Well, I'm enjoying both parts, honestly. Drink that up and we'll go back on the floor. I can do quick steps." She looked earnestly at him and rested a hand on his arm. "Dear James, do you think it's wise for us to go around together like this?" she asked him. "Why ever not?" he said in alarm. "Because you're so sweet to me and I'm getting too much fond of you." She said this in a tone that combined the vibrant with the flat, like a great actress demonstrating the economical conveyance of strong emotion. This was her habit, making her avows. In the midst of his panic, Dixon managed to find the thought that this, if true, would indeed be grounds for seeing less of each other. Then he hit on a remark both honest and acceptable. "You mustn't say things like that." She laughed lightly. "Poor James," she said. "Keep my seat from me, will you, darling? I shan't be long." She went out. Poor James, poor James. It was, in fact, a very just characterization, but hardly one for her to make, surely her of all people. Then a sense of guilt sent him diving for his glass. Guilt not only for this latest reflection, but for the unintentional irony of "you're so sweet to me." It was doubtful, he considered, whether he was capable of being at all sweet. Much less so sweet to anybody at all. Whatever passably decent treatment Margaret had from him was the result of a temporary victory of fear over irritation and or pity over boredom. That behavior of such origin could seem so sweet to her might be taken a reflection on her sensitivity, but it was also a terrible commentary on her frustration and loneliness. Poor old Margaret, he thought with a shudder. He must try harder. But what would be the consequences to her of treatment more consistently sweet, or of a higher level of sweetness? What would be the consequences to him? To drive away these speculations, he began listening to the conversation on his left. "I have the utmost respect for his opinion," Bertrand was saying. The bay in his voice was well throttled back. Perhaps someone had upbraided him about it. "I always say he's the last of the old-fashioned professional critics, and so he knows what he's talking about, which is more than you can say for most of the fraternity nowadays. While we kept running into each other at the same exhibitions, and funnily enough, in front of the same pictures," here he laughed, momentarily raising one shoulder. "One day he said to me, 'I want to see your work. People tell me it's good,' so I packed up an assortment of small stuff and took it round to his house. It's a lovely place, isn't it? You must know it, of course. One might really be back in the Dix Butime, Dix-Butie with a line on top, M-E. Wonder how long before the Rubber Goods Workers Union takes it over, and I must say that one or two pastels seem to fetch him a vomiting basin," Dixon thought. Then horror overcame him at the thought of a man who knows what he's talking about, not only not talking about how nasty Bertrand's pictures were, not only not putting his boot through him, but actually seeming to be fetched by one or two of them. Bertrand must not be a good painter. Fucking dog. Bertrand must not be a good painter. He, Dixon, would not permit it, and yet here was the gore itch-bag fellow, not on the face of it a moron, listening to this frenzy of self-advertisement without overt protest, even with some attention. Yes, Dixon saw with very close attention. Goyukura had tilted his large dark head over towards Bertrand. His face, self-averted, eyes on the ground, wore a small intent frown, as if he were hard of hearing and couldn't bear to miss a word. Dixon couldn't bear not missing any of it. Bertrand was now using the phrase contrapuntal tone values and switched to his right, where for some moments he'd been half conscious of a silence. As he did so, Christine turned towards him. "Look, do you join in this, will you?" she said in an undertone. "I can't get her to say anything." He looked over at Carol, whose eye met his without apparent recognition, but before he could start working on what to say, Margaret returned. "Look, do you join in this? Do join in this, will you?" she said in an undertone. "I can't get her to say anything." "What, still hanging over the drink?" she said vivaciously to the whole party. "I thought you'd all be on the floor by now. Now, Mr. Goyukura, I'm not going to permit any more of this sulking about in here, principle or no principle. It's the light fantastic for you. Come along." Goya Cureheart, smiling politely, had risen to his feet, and with a word to the others, let himself be led away out of the bar. Bertrand looked across at Carol. Don't let's waste the band, my dear, he said. I paid 25 shillings for them after all. So you have, my dear, Carol said, stressing the appellation, and for a moment Dixon was afraid she meant to refuse and so bring the situation, whatever it was, to a crisis, but after that moment she got to her feet and began to move towards the dance floor. Look after Christine for me, Dixon, Bertrand bade. Don't drop her, she's a fragile. Goodbye for a little, my sweet, he fluted to Christine. I'll be back soon. Blow your whistle if the man gets rough. Care for a dance, Dixon, said to Christine. I'm not so good as I told you, but I don't mind having a crack if you don't. She smiled. Nor do I if you don't. Okay, so he says, care for a dance. I'm not much good, as I told you, but I don't mind having a crack if you don't. That's when she comes in. Nor do I if you don't. Chapter 10, man. Damn, it's kind of fucked up how he's leading that Lady Margaret on, but it's kind of like if they both got hired or they're both under the same teacher and they just so happen to be dating or whatever. So I'm on chapter 11, y'all. Peace. I'll probably read again.